Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our event and agenda for associational life. I'm Andy Smerick, a senior fellow here at the Manhattan Institute, and in just a moment, I'm going to be discussing civil society and social capital and public policy with our distinguished guest, U.S. Senator Mike Lee. Then, in about 20 minutes or so, I'm going to hand the reins off to my friend and colleague, Michael Hendricks, who's going to moderate an all-star panel on these issues. Now, before introducing Senator Lee, let me just very briefly explain why so many of us are interested in the subject and why we thought that this was the right moment to get people together to start to chat about it. As probably all of you know, in recent years, our national political discourse has become increasingly uncivil, even polarized. Many Americans feel alienated, sometimes isolated. Now, at least part of the explanation for that, many of us believe, is that power has gravitated to faraway institutions while the mediating bodies of social life, things like family, neighborhood, voluntary associations, or even local democratic entities, those have been weakened. This gradual loss of community and the deterioration of civil society has been discussed for what seems like eons, but the consequences of it now seem more pronounced than ever before. The Social Capital Project, this innovative initiative that was spearheaded by Senator Lee, that is being spearheaded by Senator Lee, as a leader of Congress's Joint Economic Committee, has produced some of the most important and interesting work for understanding these kinds of issues. Since 2017, the project has studied and generated truly a staggering amount of high-quality data and analysis on what we can call American associational life. The web of social relationships that contribute to individual and community well-being. In my view, Senator Lee's Social Capital Project is probably one of the most exciting stories in public sector activity in the last number of years. He and his team identified an underlying problem that was influencing a whole host of policy domains. They decided that they were going to repurpose a longstanding legislative committee to study the causes and effects of the problem. And then they laid the groundwork for policymakers, philanthropists, citizens, community groups to go about finding solutions. So let me now introduce our distinguished guest so we can learn more about why he launched this initiative, what he and his team have learned, and what's on the horizon. So Senator Mike Lee was elected to serve Utah in the United States Senate in the year 2010. Prior to his election, he practiced law in the private sector and had a distinguished career in the public sector as well. He served as an assistant U.S. attorney, general counsel to his state's governor, Governor John Huntsman, and as a law clerk to then appeals court judge and then later U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sam Alito. So thank you so much for joining us, Senator Lee. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's really good to be with you.
Great. Well, let's start, if you don't mind, with something that may seem a little bit technical, but I think is the most interesting starting point for this, which is the JEC itself, the Joint Economic Committee. What you and your team did was entrepreneurial and something that we typically don't see inside of government all that often. You repurposed a committee that, as far as I can tell, since 1946 had been doing the same kinds of stuff with data, unemployment figures, labor force participation, GDP, and you decided that it could be used for a different purpose. And so the lesson here that I try to tell younger people in particular is this is a way of thinking about making sure longstanding institutions keep up with the times and can address contemporary challenges and opportunities. So maybe if you don't mind, just start off by telling us about the effort to use JEC as a vehicle for this as opposed to what it had done for, 60 or 70 years.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. I'm grateful for your question. The short answer is that we look to where there's a need and we try to fill that need. Now, the Joint Economic Committee was created to be Congress's economic research arm. This occurred at a time when there wasn't the constellation of think tanks and data-driven policy analysis that you can find in great abundance in Washington and in other parts of the country today. So when I had the opportunity to do something about this, when I became the senior Republican on the committee, first serving as vice chair and now as chairman of the committee, we didn't want to just replicate what other researchers and other think tanks were doing. As we all know, there's not exactly a shortage of data or analysis about, say, GDP growth or monetary policy or the growth effects of tax policy. So what we looked for were needs, were the issues and the questions that were and are highly relevant to policy, but under-researched. Fairly quickly, we found that the question of social capital and community association, issues related to social connectedness, these were things that were very high on both lists. And it also dovetailed nicely with the policy work that my office had already been working on ever since I came to the Senate about, communitarianism, subsidiarity, and civil society. My longstanding belief that the twin pillars of any successful society include robust institutions of civil society and free markets. And then with some obvious questions raised by the 2016 election, we were spurred on and became even more convinced that this was necessary, that it was timely, that there be an appetite for it, without regard to political affiliation. And because these issues haven't all been swallowed up by partisan tribalism, at least not yet, they provide for me and to others something of a welcomed respite from the shirts and skins debates, the A team against the B team or the red team against the blue team debates that members so often endure and that get them sidetracked. So Vice Chairman Beyer has been a great partner on some of our hearings, and our hearings have been, I think, models of high-minded inquiry on both sides of the aisle and at both ends of the Capitol. As for our success in doing this, I think there's always an appetite for good ideas. Better ideas tend to make for better debates, and when you have better debates, it tends to lead to improved policy. I want to develop that policy. So we built our team, starting with our first executive director, Scott Winship, and now with our current executive director, Vanessa Brown Calder. Not just to contribute to academic discussions, but also to inform our policy staff in crafting legislation.
Well, that's great. And actually, it's a really interesting segue to a challenge that I have generally in this domain, studying it and working mostly through the state government, which is when thinking about social capital, we can agree that it touches a whole host of policy domains, or it affects them, everything from transportation and housing and family and education. But it's not always clear who should do what if the ultimate outcome is increase or grow, strengthen social capital. That is, what should Uncle Sam actually do? What should the state government actually do? What should the city, the town do? What should philanthropists do? So you've created this gigantic body of research, and you're sitting in the Capitol, presumably in Washington, D.C. So can you give us some thoughts about how you go about thinking, what should the federal government do and what should it not do? And then what should these other, to use your term, subsidiarity, what that teaches us, that the state has duties and powers, responsibilities. What should it do? What should the family do? What should donors do?
So the governing principles that you've outlined really are critical. They're fundamental. And we work pretty hard to try to integrate them into everything we do. And although our project is located at the federal level, because that's where we are, we're federal lawmakers, we think that an important piece of our task is to remind policymakers and the rest of our audience, that is anyone who's willing to read or listen, that many of the most important actions that can be undertaken to strengthen social capital don't necessarily happen within the federal level at all. Mm-hmm. Some of them don't even happen within government at all. Some of them do. I've long said that government doesn't have the ability to create institutions of civil society, and bad things tend to happen when government pretends that it does. But there are things governments can do that can weaken those institutions. One of our jobs is to make sure that those aren't weakened and to figure out where it might be weakening them. Anyway, but still we believe there are places where it's possible to provide meaningful and appropriate federal policy recommendations. Especially, again, insofar as those recommendations relate to removing some kind of impediment to social capital that is currently imposed by the federal government. So one example of many that we could point to here is charitable giving. Nonprofits, churches, and other voluntary institutions play an absolutely essential role in American life. They help provide for people's needs, supporting the stability of community institutions and supplying goods such as education and the arts, things that people can't just create for themselves. You have to do that as part of a group or a community. So charitable giving thus becomes the lifeblood of organizations like that. And without donations and donations in kind of money and of time and talents and so forth, these organizations simply can't do what they do, including providing the indirect benefits of personal connectedness, reciprocity, and trust that are invaluable to the thriving of any community or of any country. But we found that while total American charitable giving has increased in most years over the last half century or so, the overall percentage of Americans giving has actually decreased. It's gone down from 66% in 2000 to 56% in 2014. And there has been a particularly pronounced drop among lower income Americans. Also, the share of individual giving as a proportion of total giving has dropped over time. It was at 83% in 1978. It went down to 68% in 2018. The foundations, corporations, and bequests are increasingly driving American giving. And as a result, the Social Capital Project proposed figuring out ways to reform the charitable deduction. This has been a longstanding part of our tax code to make it an above-the-line deduction. Currently the benefits of the deduction overwhelmingly go to high-income taxpayers, and that has produced results that we shouldn't find terribly surprising. But by moving the deduction above the line, in other words, making it available to both itemizers and those taking the standard deduction, this is a reform that would tend to ensure that all taxpayers' donations receive the same tax treatment, and the government isn't, however, unintentionally discouraging American philanthropic efforts, especially among those who are contributing on a smaller scale. I also supported the inclusion of a one-time above-the-line deduction of $300 for non-itemizers in the CARES Act, which was passed earlier this year. This is the kind of policy that's really important, especially during a pandemic. Yep. And it tends to illustrate the way that the tax code should treat charitable giving, not only during a pandemic, but in any year. So charitable deduction reform is just one example. But over the previous 2 years, we've outlined other reforms to create, for instance, universal savings accounts and improve foster care and adoption policy to increase housing affordability through local reforms to regulatory processes that sometimes increase costs, and to connect more Americans to work through stable monetary policy, among other things. In some cases, changes that are recommended, these kinds of changes are recommended at the local level. And in other instances, we might suggest improving policy at both the federal and the local level. But wherever policy reform takes place, we're always looking for a chance to highlight the incredible, irreplaceable work of civil society and philanthropic institutions in particular.
Well, I think that's great. And the point that you raised at the beginning is one that has really shaped my thinking on this, which is we ought to think of government often in this domain as like a Hippocratic oath style thing, like first do no harm. What are the things that the government is doing that is stopping civil society from developing and social capital from expanding? And one thing I learned from Robert Nisbet, The Quest for Community, is this idea that associations, voluntary groups, even small communities that are related to local government, they lose their meaning, they lose their power when their purpose goes away. So every time the government does more, this association of people, if they don't have a reason for being, they have a tendency just to kind of disappear. And what I find interesting is I've been doing some research on the progressive era and a little before, and it seems like there were these eras in American history. So right before the turn of the 20th century, when a disproportionate number of new universities were created, people came together and said, we need new higher education bodies. Then in the first years of the 20th century, we saw the creation of the Boy Scouts and Kiwanis and the American Legion and all these fraternal organizations. So do you have any thoughts on that? Like, how do we create a new generation of people thinking about entrepreneurialism in the social sector so we can build up social capital and civil society? What can government do to foster that?
Yeah, I like your reference there to the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And I completely agree with what you're describing. As I like to say, whenever government steps in and does too much, the muscle of civil society starts to atrophy.
That's right.
It's almost an inevitability. I was influenced by a presentation that I saw while I was in college. We had a guest speaker. I believe he was a parliamentarian from Norway who was giving a guest lecture at Brigham Young University, where I was a student studying political science at the time. He described some of the long haul effects that he had seen on his country and on its culture as a result of a really aggressive and paternalistic social welfare system. And he said that it had had some unanticipated consequences, resulting in neighbors sometimes not caring about neighbors. There were some examples that he provided about how sometimes within the same apartment building, someone would know that there was a serious health issue with a neighbor, but they wouldn't necessarily stop to check on them. And it wasn't that they were acting out of cruelty or reckless indifference to the suffering of another human, but that there had been kind of a cultural response to the growth of government in this area, that people felt like it wasn't their place, that it would be out of place to do someone else's job, that they would be stepping on the shoes of someone else, and that they shouldn't do it. And as a result, neighbors had stopped talking to each other as much. And a lot of this reminds me of some of the work that's been done over time. You know, our associational life, as writers from Alexis de Tocqueville to Robert Nisbet, Bob Putnam, and Charles Murray have identified, this is an essential part of what makes us American. Yeah. And we haven't waited for government to come in to solve our problems. Americans tend to roll up their sleeves and get to work to do it on their own. But where government is playing too heavy a role, sometimes that won't happen. And having the government get in and exert too much influence can cause the opposite of what we want to bring about. So it gets back to the first do no harm principle. Because I think it's very dangerous for government to try to legislate, to try to pick and choose. Inevitably, when government tries to create institutions of civil society, it's reinventing a wheel in a way that can be very dangerous and that crowds out opportunity and innovation that would otherwise be there. But it needs to look for areas where it's harming those. So the parent tax penalty. We've talked a lot about the marriage tax penalty. Few people talk about the parent tax penalty, where the way our income tax system and our senior entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare, interact is such that if you imagine two hypothetical couples, couple A and couple B, they're identical in every respect. Mortgage interest, charitable contributions, earning everything, identical in every respect, except that couple A has 4 children, couple B remains childless. Over time, our tax and senior entitlement programs don't adequately recognize the expenses that couple A undertakes in raising their children, who are then going to go on to support the senior entitlement programs through our pay-as-you-go funding mechanisms. And so that's one of the reasons why I've advocated for an increase in the child tax credit. We achieved a significant victory on that in the 2017 tax reform package. I still think it needs to be increased further, but that's one of many examples of where we just need to look at something that the government has done, perhaps with the best of intentions, but in a way that's harming people.
I think something that you have alluded to here a couple times is important for especially state policymakers to think about, which is, and again, I learned this from Hayek's Nobel-winning speech, where he encouraged policymakers to think not as engineers, but as gardeners. The point being, don't try to always do the thing, create the conditions so society can get the thing done. And so if we make sure that people have more money to give to charity, that there are government grant programs or tax credit programs, that individuals and communities can come together and decide we want to reallocate our money to solve the opioid addiction crisis in this way, or to create new schools in that way, that is a much, I think, both healthier and light-handed way for the state to get involved in these things, which leads to one of these, obviously your team has come up with more reports that I'm able to read, but something that was really fascinating to me is one of the reports showing the geographic distribution of social capital, that these kinds of things that we've been talking about actually differ quite a bit based on where you are, even at the county level. And so I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, and particularly your home state of Utah being the best, at least according to a couple measures out there in terms of social capital. Like, what can we learn from the fact that in the Deep South, things aren't all that good? In the Northern Plains, they're pretty good. In Utah, they're great. Did you take any lessons from that?
Yeah, I did. And I want to be very clear. I was elated that Utah came out as the state with the highest social capital ranking, but I promise I didn't rig the standard, didn't rig the test so that it would happen. It was a pleasant surprise, although not terribly surprising, given that that's where I live and I know the people there. So yeah, I'm really proud of all the work that JEC has put out over the last 4 years. I think when I think about the foundational work that our team did and understanding the formation of social capital on a follow-on report, looking at which places have social capital and which places don't, is something that we're especially proud of within the Joint Economic Committee. Some of the trends that we've outlined in our initial reports and our overview research, including our civil society and family stability reports, are stunning. For instance, the share of Americans who agree that most Americans can be trusted, most people can be trusted, rather, has nearly dropped in half over the last 5 decades.
Yeah.
And participation in church and membership organizations is down, especially for lower income households. And then between 1972, a year after I was born, and 2018, just a couple of years ago, the share of adults who reported that they had never attended religious services tripled. And so our initial research laid the groundwork for papers to come after that, including one paper that traces dramatic rise in unwed childbearing, which is a key question that too many policymakers shy away from, but that more and more are having to acknowledge now, because it's telling us something. Not everybody agrees as to what it's telling us, or more importantly, what we should do about it. But the share of births born to unwed mothers is around 40%, which is up from just 5% in 1960. The share of single-parent homes is one of the factors that is most widely known to be correlated with low social capital scores. And we know that children are at risk for poor outcomes when raised outside of a married parent home. So understanding that trend and combating it has been one of our key 5 focus areas.
Well, I know you have a vote. I could talk to you about this all day long, and I know you have to run. So if you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with folks, especially, for example, like what is on the horizon for JEC and the Social Capital Project, would love to hear it. But we also don't want to keep you away from your constitutional duty to vote.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I can't ever forget the duty to vote, especially when every once in a while when rushing to vote. If I exceed the speed limit a little bit, I have to think about the speech and debate clause. But yeah, as far as final thoughts, I first want to refer back to Alexis de Tocqueville. If any of you haven't read that in a while, it's good to reread it every few years.
Agreed.
Every time I reread it, it seems more relevant to our society today than it did the previous time, or more insightful at least. So I'm always looking for to try to evaluate how Alexis de Tocqueville would view present day America. But we've spent nearly 4 years laying the groundwork, but we still have a lot to accomplish within the Social Capital Project. And we've got an almost endless supply of remaining topics that we want to explore. And we have associated legislative work that we want to do. The project's currently working on a diverse range of topics that we consider timely, including higher education, healthcare, youth and technology, workplace flexibility, police reform, criminal justice reform, and a lot of others. Given the impact of COVID-19 on our relationships, our social connectedness, our associational lives, and the pressure that the pandemic is putting on our institutions, including churches, schools, civic groups, and so forth, we expect that the work we do in the next Congress is going to continue considering how our current circumstances threaten institutions of social society, civil society, and social capital, and make them more critical than ever before. And so the project's going to have some interesting things to say about how we can rebuild our communities and relationships following the crisis. But regardless of next year's politics, we're fortunate because we're able to move the work of the Social Capital Project forward. We've got big plans. We're looking forward to continue to develop a positive policy agenda and to look for opportunities and allies to implement that agenda in the new year.
Well, thank you so much for generally your public service, but also specifically the Joint Economic Committee's transition to the Social Capital Project. It's been just a treasure trove of information, and you deserve a whole lot of credit for pushing this. So thank you. We wish you best holidays and hope to see you in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to talk to you, Andy.
Great. So let me now pass the baton to my friend and colleague, Michael Hendricks, who is going to help lead this next panel. Michael, I hope we set you up for some fruitful conversation. I certainly learned a lot there. So thank you for taking it from here.
It's a great setup. You sure did, Andy. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Senator. We're excited to continue our conversation on an agenda for associational life with a terrific panel. For all those watching right now, please enter your questions in whatever platform you're watching us on, and I'll incorporate your questions into our discussion. So without further ado, I'll welcome our panel. First up is Kay Heimowitz. She's the William E. Simon Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor at City Journal. She's written extensively on childhood and family issues, poverty, cultural change in America, and last but not least, Brooklyn, New York. Thank you so much for joining us. We're also joined by Bob Woodson, the founder and president of the Woodson Center, which he founded in 1981 to help the residents of low-income communities to address the problems of their communities and to empower them as such. Formerly of the National Urban League, he is an early MacArthur Genius awardee, so we're talking to a certified genius here, a recipient of the Bradley Prize, the Presidential Citizens Award, and the Social Entrepreneurship Award at the Manhattan Institute. And then last but not least, Scott Winship, a resident scholar and director of poverty studies at AEI, where he researches social mobility and the causes and effects of poverty. Before joining AEI, he ran the Social Capital Project under Senator Mike Lee, which we just heard about. So thank you to all of you as our panelists.
Great to be here, Michael.
All right, so let's dive right in. And actually back up too as we do that. So how do we define social capital? What is it? We heard a lot about it. We heard it referenced in the previous discussion, but how do we define it? How do we see it in action? Scott, I'll turn to you first, and then Kay and Bob jump in. Quick definition of social capital. How do you look at it, Scott?
Great question, Michael, and thanks for having me here. It's great to be reconnected with my Manhattan Institute colleagues. I was at the Manhattan Institute a couple jobs ago. For how do you define social capital, it's interesting. I think even among academics, who've been studying it their entire careers, you ask any two of them and you get different answers. And it's unfortunate because I think it's pretty straightforward. There's two words in social capital. Social capital is capital, meaning that it's productive in the same way that financial capital is productive for people, physical capital is productive, human capital, the skills that we have are productive. In the same way, social capital is productive for people, whatever it is that they're trying to achieve, whatever their ends are, social capital works towards achieving them. And the other word is social. So it's really about our relationships. So social capital to me is just the value that inheres in our relationships, or you can just think of social capital as being relationships themselves.
That's fascinating. Kay, how do you view social capital? And I wonder too, if you can just tease apart the role of institutions in social capital and informing that.
Right. Well, first of all, let me just say that one of the reasons that I really appreciate this line of inquiry is because so much of social science has concentrated, particularly economics, has concentrated on the lone individual, the rational actor, as the economists talk about it. The social capital meme, the idea, reminds us that we're interconnected in a way that social science doesn't always allow for. So I see the concept as a kind of corrective to some of the thinking that we see in policy and social science circles about individual people, individual families even. Social capital insists that the interconnections make it impossible just to think about the individual.
Bob, is that how you see it? How do you view this?
I view it in the context of the response that individuals have in disadvantaged situations. We see the response to low-income leaders who are not allow themselves and their behavior to be dictated by the challenges in their circumstances. I define individuals like that as liking unto human antibodies that exist within the most troubled circumstances, grassroots leaders who are achieving against the odds. I think that often what troubles me is that we never seem to look at low-income communities as containing much social capital, and therefore we always look to external means of helping these communities, and that's some of the challenges that I've had to face. And so what we have done is we recognize that that the sickest part of the body draws the strongest antibodies, and that these individuals, when they come together, if properly nurtured, can form an immune system. So families, communities can be healed from the inside out and the bottom up if we can just recognize that the most low-income communities have agents of uplift within them. So that's how I look at social capital.
And Bob, just as a quick follow-up, do you think scholars of civil society often overlook poorer communities? We often talk about, there'll be some study of the 3/4 of a poorer community that are suffering from, a certain malady or a conflict of some kind, but we really don't hear about the other 25%, maybe how, what are the sources of their thriving? Bob, do you think we overlook that?
Yeah, my greatest frustration over the past 30 years has been both liberals and conservatives use the same social construct in looking at low-income communities. They do what I call failure studies. They come in and they talk about how many people are raising children that are dropping out of school or in jail and drugs. And then they talk about then how can the left says then the answer to that problem is to give them more government subsidy. And people on the right said that since what we've invested hasn't worked, then what we should do is reduce it. And so most of the comments coming from the right are how do we remove perverse incentives for people to achieve. Neither side goes into those communities and explores why 30% of the families are raising children or not dropping out of school. There are very few studies of capacity or agency. Most of it is studying pathology. I call them failure studies. And you can learn nothing from studying failure except how to create failure. And but this has been one of my biggest frustrations, that many of the experts in this field offer very few solutions, but they're great on analysis. They're almost like autopsies.
Bob, that's fascinating. This is actually a great tee up for me to turn to you, Scott. You've done both the analysis and you've teased out some of the solutions, but I think you've also heard here how there's various different aspects of social capital to study. So just first off, how did you approach the question of social capital and studying it, even as you did create an index when you started out at the Social Capital Project?
Yeah, so we started out really agnostic about whether there was really going to be a thing that hang together, called social capital, when we actually looked at the data out there. And what we found, which was reassuring, I think, is that a lot of the things that you would expect to be indicators of social capital, of the presence of valuable relationships, they tend to, first of all, they all tend to trend the same way, which is generally big declines over time in terms of the things that we do together, whether in families, with our neighbors, socializing with our coworkers after hours, things we do in community organizations, in religious communities. All of that has sort of declined over time. So that's the first indication that there really is a there. And then the other thing that we found when we looked across states and across counties in the United States, taking all of the data that we could find out there that was related to relationships, is that they tend to trend the same way geographically as well. The places that have a lot of married parent families are also the places where there's a lot of charitable giving, are also the places where there are a lot of participation in community organizations, are also the places where parents and kids spend a lot of time interacting together. And so that is another indication that there's something there that makes sense. And it really speaks to the fact that what we're talking about is the presence of relationships and reliance on relationships. And those look worse over time, and they look worse in the southern United States versus in the sort of northern Midwestern United States and northern New England. But they tend to sort of follow very consistent patterns over time.
Okay, just to tease that out a little bit more, what was the regional variation in social capital as you measured it?
Yeah, so we broke everything into, at the state level, I think 7 different areas that included kind of family stability, family interaction, community health, institutional health, philanthropic health, and also violent crime rates. I think that's 7. And so we looked at a range of things across all those areas, from how much screen time do kids end up having, to how many families are headed by 2 parents, to do you trust your neighbors, do you do things with your neighbors, do you vote regularly, how much confidence do you have in big business or in government, for instance. And they all do sort of tend to cluster together in the same places and over time.
That's fascinating. Kay, is this something that you see as well? I mean, where do you see the reservoirs of social capital in New York City or in a place like Brooklyn? Where do you look for that?
Well, I guess through the same data that Scott is using. We look at the crime levels, the sense of activity, civic activity in the neighborhood. Where I live in Park Slope has always been very proudly civic minded. Now, it's important to mention at this point that we're talking about a relatively affluent neighborhood, and we are seeing a bigger decline in social capital in poorer and working class areas in particular. One of the most troubled are the white working class areas of the Heartland and Appalachia. And I got interested in this partly because I was reading about deaths of despair. That is the increasing number of deaths by suicide, by drug and alcohol addiction that people were finding in those areas in the Heartland and elsewhere. The opioid crisis is one of the most well-known symptoms of this problem. And that seemed to be related to a number of things. One of them was the breakdown of the traditional sources of economic capacity in those areas with the decline of manufacturing and mining. Whether we know for sure that led to the decline in marriage, we don't know for sure which comes first, but we know that there has been a huge decline in stable family life in the white working class. So again, that's it's partly related to income, but that's not the whole story.
Scott, I wonder if you had a response to that, because I also seem to recall from your studies you teasing out the role of affluence in changing levels of social capital. Share with us what you found and how that intersects with what Kay is saying.
Yeah, so I think the relationship between affluence and income on the one hand and social capital on the other is really complicated. So we argued pretty consistently over and over again that the declines over, say, the last 50 years in social capital, contrary to I think what a lot of people think, are really consequences of our rising affluence, which comes through in the fact that we need each other less, to help with things. In the past, we would rely on our neighbors to help raise a barn. These days, like, people are rich enough to pay for people to buy or to build a home, or they just buy an existing home. Similarly, childcare, we rely on our neighbors less than that. When I was a kid running around, all the other parents in the neighborhood were looking out for everybody else. Now we are more inclined to pay for childcare. It comes through in the opportunities that are available to women today to have a broader range of careers and economic opportunities, which has been fantastic. I think I'm to be clear, very glad that happened. But it also has left a bit of a void in our communities because men didn't sort of get together and say, well, great, now that women are working more, we can devote more time to the community. Instead, nobody's devoting as much time to the community. So over time, I think it's a reflection of affluence. Now, the paradox here is that, as Kay is suggesting, if you just look today at which communities are rich in social capital, or whether social capital tends to look better, more available among richer people rather than poorer people, it's absolutely the case that it's more affluent people who look better on all these indicators. Now, they've experienced declines in social capital over time as well, but nevertheless, they seem to be their relationships seem to be healthier and stronger, more numerous, and to provide more access to valuable things. And I think that's a complicated paradox to explain. I think a lot of it has to do with just what happens to people who don't have a lot of resources when a lot of norms around doing things together and doing things for other people and not being as self-interested or self-focused, when those norms go out the window, and when the affluent leave a lot of communities and leave people behind, then you get a sort of erosion of norms that don't hurt people at the top who have resources to deal with, the risk of getting pregnant, for instance, whereas folks lower down don't have as many resources to deal with that sort of thing. And so you get worse outcomes, you get less community trust, less trust in institutions. It's a much bigger question, but that's sort of the best I can do. And
no, this is fascinating how affluence can afford more individualism, more independence, but not everybody can afford it. Not everybody can pay that price.
Yeah.
Bob, I see you leaning in here. This actually makes me. Go ahead.
Let me offer an alternative narrative based upon my experience. I believe that one of the challenges is to take some of the principles that operate in our market economy and apply it to the social economy. In our market economy, most of the innovation is driven by 3% of the people who are entrepreneurs, and they tend to be C students. They produce 70% of the new jobs. I believe the same principle works in our social economy, that there are a small group of social entrepreneurs. These are people who are achieving against the odds, and they can have the same impact in the social milieu as the entrepreneur does in the market economy. And by contrast, I'll give you an example that the only scholar that I know that wrote about this was Myron Magner from Manhattan Institute, and that is Kimmy Gray. We worked for about 15 years with a group in Southeast Washington, Northeast Washington called Kenilworth Parkside, a drug-infested, crime-ridden neighborhood, 3,000 people, 640 households. But the leadership there, a woman named Kimmy Gray, who was abandoned by her husband, a divorce at age 22, 5 children. She sent all 5 children to college and got off welfare in 3 years. She then engaged in organizing her community to a resident management association. And I won't take the time, but they began to take charge of their community and drove the drug dealers out. And as a consequence, they sent 600 kids to college from public housing, which just about eliminated teen pregnancy. And so we detailed all of the steps that she took. Another program like that in St. Louis with Cochran Public Housing that was profiled on 60 Minutes. If you go on YouTube and type in Bertha Gilkey 60 Minutes, you will see another island of excellence that was created by investing in these grassroots entrepreneurs. 60 Minutes could find them, but we didn't have one researcher come in to either of these communities to try to assess how and why they were able to achieve against the odds. They just about wiped out teen pregnancy in that community. But there was very little social scientists coming in assessing how they achieve against the odds and what are lessons that can be drawn from those experiences that we then can inform public policy. We found, for instance, that government was injuring them because if they reduced their costs and increased their income, the money would be returned to the federal government. So we got that law changed. In other words, we should look at what people are actually doing to help themselves and then determine how government minimally can stop interfering with what they do. But we never seem to look in the community suffering the problems for innovative ways to change policies. Instead, we just do an analysis of the pathology and not do studies of success like this.
That is fascinating. We're getting a lot of questions coming in from the audience. Please keep them coming. One of them, I think maybe directed to you, Bob, is from Kenneth. He's asking, are you worried at all if these government solutions are at all crowding out or taking over the role of civic organizations to help poorer communities?
Absolutely. That's how we got to where we are now in the Black community with the out of wedlock births. Up until 1965, 85% of all Black families had a man and a woman raising children. But Cloud and Piven at the Columbia University School of Social Work, they decided that one of the ways to show the contradictions of capitalism is to flood the system with welfare workers. And she said, if you can detach work from income, the man will be redundant and you will see an explosion of pathology. And she was right. and government actually recruited people. So you had, according to Fred Siegel, in his book, The Future Once Happened Here, that thousands of blacks flooded into the welfare system at a time when the unemployment rate for black men in New York was just 4%. And what they predicted and helped contrive to happen. And that's when you see an explosion of out-of-wedlock births in the black community directly related to government policy. Not the only reason, but they were the major contributor. But let me just say that there were two conservative mayors that really governed on these mediating structures policies. Dick Riordan in 1990 in Los Angeles and Steve Goldsmith in Indianapolis. They took these into the communities and worked with local leaders. And as a consequence, it's the only examples I can think of where Republican conservative policies actually went in and empowered low-income people by working closely with them.
That's fascinating. Kay, there's another question from the audience here. Harry is asking about the workplace and work. I wonder if you have any thoughts on workplace as an institution for social capital formation.
Well, I don't think there's any question, but that the workplace has been in the past and remains so for many people, an important site of social capital. You make friends there, you share information, you get connections through them. And it's terribly important. One of the ways that I first came to really understand this was to read a book, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the author, called Janesville, which is about the collapse of Janesville, Wisconsin. Is it Wisconsin? I think it is. Yeah.
Paul Ryan.
That had to do with the closure of a factory, or maybe it was more than one. And what happened to the families in the surrounding town is just so heartbreaking, and you begin to realize just how much, if you read a book like that, or maybe there are others that I don't know of, just how much the workplace is a center of civic life, really. There are all kinds of charities that people engage in through the workplace. There are team sports that are put together at the workplace. It's been terribly important in the heartland communities, in particular, where things are so distressed right now.
What about remote work, COVID-19?
Well, what's interesting is that remote work is going to throw people back on their immediate social connections. I mean, it's going to be difficult to make new friends, right? And even your work friends, your work husbands and wives are going to be a little more distant. So I think that will be lost. I mean, there's a lot to be gained in remote work, I know from experience, but there is a real downside as well. So I think that there are all kinds of reasons that COVID is going to upset the traditional or usual ways of creating social capital, and we'll probably be able to talk about some of that.
Scott, how have you seen the social landscape changing during COVID-19? I mean, I could see it cutting both ways. You know, we see our need for community now more than ever. We're more aware of it. We have more digital tools to access other people, but also perhaps low-income workers are suffering here, especially the elderly, I would imagine, are suffering from a lack of connection. How have things changed as you've seen from COVID-19?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question. You know, in some ways, you know, the virus has required us to socially distance from each other. And so in some ways, defeating the virus has required that we be antisocial. On the other hand, you know, the costs of that have been that we've all really suffered from not having these social connections. Many of us have been fortunate, and the costs have been along the lines of, well, we don't, go to happy hour once a week anymore. But for other people, if you're, an elderly mother, grandmother in a nursing home who can't see her grandkids, that's much more severe. If you're in a neighborhood that where there's not a lot of trust around, and so you don't feel like you can go out and do things with your neighbors, that's another kind of social cost. And of course, the people who have actually not been able to social distance at all, maybe haven't experienced the social costs that the rest of us have, but they've had to go into the workplace at risk to their own health, and sort of dependent on other people to continue spending their money to keep the businesses open. It's been really interesting. It's very hard to do rigorous social science research on this kind of stuff, and I've not seen great stuff on it. But there have been a number of studies that have shown that places that have had more social capital, according to our measure and according to some other indicators, tended to social distance earlier and better, and they had fewer deaths per capita, cases per capita. So it appears that that the way social capital has worked in the pandemic is that places that have a sense of social solidarity and sort of fellow feeling towards each other, or maybe even a trust in institutions, have been the places that have been safest and healthiest versus some of the other places, even though their greater social capital might have, pushed in the direction of their doing more and socially distancing less and having worse outcomes.
I find it incredible to talk about social cohesion at a time of such polarization too. We have this uniting foe in COVID-19, and yet, not just the backdrop of an election, but the backdrop of an election. And there's so many things that also are dividing us now. Do we need certain narratives or foes or agendas to unite us in order to reknit, frayed social fabrics?
Yeah, let me comment. That's why the Woodson Center, we established 1776 Unites, because the New York Times, as you know, in 2019, Nicole Hannah-Jones in 1619, defining America as a slavetocracy, and using the Black experience as a bludgeon to say that all whites are the beneficiaries of privilege, and therefore they should be punished, and all Blacks are victims to be paid. And so what we did at the Woodson Center is, since the messengers were Black, we decided to bring together a group of Black scholars and activists to offer not a counter debate, but a counter narrative to disprove and debunk this notion. And so we released our first alternative curriculum. We had about 5,000 downloads in 6 days. So we really think that our goal is to deracialize race and desegregate poverty. That the whole race grievance industry must be challenged by an alternative narrative. And one of those, of course, is that the state of Blacks today, with the out-of-wedlock births of violence, is somehow a legacy of slavery and discrimination, the history, and that's the shadow. It's just not true. But what we're offering is examples from the past of how, when whites were at their worst, Blacks were at their best. We closed the education gap in the South between 1920 and 1940 by establishing 5,000 Rosenwald schools. Our marriage rate between 1930 and 1940 was the highest of any group in society. So we think these kind of facts need to be presented as evidence that the biggest challenge that we face today is not racial, and it is cultural. So, but we think that we must stand up to that challenge and give voice to the silent Black majority that is not represented by the elite leadership on the liberal left is not really giving voice. So we're giving voice to low-income Blacks who support the police, who support self-determination, who support the bourgeois values of self-determination. And so we think that philanthropists and others, conservatives in particular, should get behind this movement. The best way to undermine the moral authority of the radicals that are trying to destroy this nation is provide a voice to those in whose name they say they are acting. Black America does not embrace or accept the definition of America as being incurably racist.
Yeah, Kay, please jump in.
It seems to me that you can't really talk about social capital without talking about the sense of agency, that is, people feeling like they can accomplish something. And what I worry about with what's going on in the schools right now is that we are basically saying you can't succeed. There's no cause for optimism, no cause for exercising your agency, except to protest, but really not for anything else. And I think that is going to be it's not just divisive ideologically.
Dangerous.
We understand. It also divides people in their sense of what can we accomplish, and trying to figure out what, was there a time, well, like you say, Bob, was there a time where people really could take the initiative and do accomplish something? I think that those positive stories are really, really important. And clearly we're not going to be able to go back to the, I never tell a lie, George Washington, but we are going, it is possible to tell a lot of really positive stories and to prepare kids for understanding that it's up to them, the next generation, to make a difference.
Yeah, unfortunately, nothing is more lethal than to convey to young people that their destiny is determined by somebody who hates them.
Right.
That nothing is more lethal than a good excuse for failure.
Well,
and so that's what we're trying to confront right now. And I think we're being successful, but that message has to come. We have to stand up for that.
Scott, I wonder what your response is to all of this.
Yeah, so I'm of a couple minds. I mean, I think it is really important to encourage agency, I think, and the sort of excesses of woke liberals in 2020 definitely frustrated me as much as anybody. But on the other hand, I think it is important to acknowledge that there are real structural barriers. You just look at a question like how many kids grow up in concentrated poverty, and that's important because we think probably growing up in concentrated poverty comes with a lot of disadvantages. That ends up being 2/3 of African American kids experience the level of neighborhood poverty that about 6% of white kids do. Now, you don't want to sort of give Black kids growing up in those circumstances the impression there's nothing they can do, that they're victims of the deck being stacked against them. But on the other hand, it's equally unrealistic or unfair even to say like, you've got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps just like everybody else. I think we do have an obligation to recognize and deal with those structural barriers. And as much as I think the 1619 Project got some really important facts wrong, the sentiment behind it, I think was trying to be patriotic. I think it was trying to say, hey, like in some ways, like the biggest patriots in American history have been African Americans who have wanted to extend the promise of the ideals of the revolution. And so there's got to be like some sort of middle ground, I think.
Well, but
pivot the conversation
ask you, what is the racial remedy for that problem? I think when we fail to separate out a racial remedy from a class remedy, because the very fact that when you look at it through a prism of race and you talk about inequities, the question is, why do the second generation of Caribbeans who come here, Nigerians who are also Black, how their incomes are more excessive than whites compared to whites? How are they achieving? And so, but say it's structural. I'm not so sure what that means, because as soon as you say it's structural, it implies that it's immutable, and therefore, what is the answer? What is it that white people can do that can cause a Black child living in one of those neighborhoods to achieve?
Well, Scott, feel free to respond, but I also want us to not get sidetracked on an equally important conversation. But Scott, feel free to jump in.
Well, I'll try to steer back to social capital. I think just to cite one example, like one of the reasons why we have so much concentrated poverty relates to our zoning and land use policies, for instance. So that's an area where policy could promote more building and more building in more places that would give more poor people access to better schools, perhaps more opportunity promoting influences around their neighbors, something like that. And that's an instance where there are historical structural reasons, redlining earlier in the 20th century, where certain people were not allowed to buy, where the terms that banks gave to people who wanted to buy or sell their homes, differed by race. And so I'm not saying that doesn't mean that we are obliged to do reparations or something like that. But it does mean that there are reasons why so many Black kids grow up in concentrated poverty versus white kids. So I do think policy can address these inequities in not directly race conscious ways, but in ways that enhance the social capital that's available to everybody, but that will frankly benefit African Americans more than other Americans.
Now, this,
Scott,
excuse me, if I may,
Oh, go
just if I may, this is where research could be very helpful. When you talk about redlining, I would like to see some research that goes into Chicago in 1929, when there, in the face of redlining, there were 731 Black-owned businesses in the Bronzeville section of Chicago. There were Blacks owned $100 million in real estate assets with an out-of-wedlock birth like 10%. What were the causes? How did they accomplish that in the face of the barriers that you mentioned? This would be very useful information, but we don't do research on looking at capacity or resilience, and why does that the 75% at the end of slavery Blacks were illiterate? That number was reduced in less than 50 years to 25%. What happened? And so it's important for us to be concentrating on, when we are researching, not just look at pathology or look at failures, but let's look at achievement.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I think this would be, I think this would be good, especially for the tail end of our conversation on where research goes next. But Scott, I want to pivot off of what you just talked about. You discussed one policy solution, tackling zoning. What are other parts of an agenda for strengthening America's associational life? I know you've done, and your team has done a lot of work on this.
Yeah, so the first 2 years of the Social Capital Project were really kind of just pure social science, like descriptive stuff. And then once Senator Lee became the chair, we shifted to developing a policy agenda. And the current team, led by Vanessa Brown Calder, is continuing to do that. We sort of organized everything into 5 different goals: kind of increasing family affordability, improving family stability, improving the effectiveness of investing in youth, rebuilding civil society, and connecting more people to work. And under each of those things, we've proposed a range of things from, some are kind of more directly related to social capital and civil society, things like, encouraging charitable giving. We had a paper on educational pluralism that was arguing that the federal funds ought to facilitate local communities creating a version of their education for their kids more in line with like their local values and preferences. You can think of things like federalism, promoting block grants and vouchers that return more authority to the local level. We talked about things that would shore up the strength of families, whether that's financial incentives to deal with marriage penalties, or programs to encourage marriage, which haven't been that successful. And then we've talked about some things that are kind of further afield, like nominal GDP targeting, as a way for the Federal Reserve to connect more people with work during times of slack in the economy, because connecting more people to work, we feel like is a real important priority if you care about social capital. The zoning stuff that we talked about, helping youth outcomes. We've done reports on foster care. So there really is a broad range of things you can tackle. Senator Lee mentioned, I was happy that he did, that we've done some thinking around policing reform, which directly gets at this question of trust in institutions, which we've seen, has been frayed this year. So we've tried to sort of assess it from a bunch of different angles. And that can get, further or closer to what most people think of as being social capital policy. But we've tried to look at it from a fairly broad view.
And then from earlier in the discussion, Senator Lee talked about first do no harm, right? There's also an aspect where the government is not doing something that could actually be helpful.
That's absolutely right. So for instance, something like safety net reforms to promote work, we view as being really important. It's an area where, as the safety net expanded, it crowded out a lot of the traditional role of families and even of neighbors. And that's had harmful consequences, we think.
And Kay, feel free to also add other planks to this policy agenda, but I'm especially curious from you where you see the opportunities between the different levels of government, federal, state, and local.
Well, on the areas that I'm most committed to trying to figure out, I don't see a lot, to be honest. I write a lot about marriage and family breakdown. I think one of the major things that policy can be considering is the child tax credit, making that fully refundable. We want to make raising a family more affordable. That means addressing the housing issue that Scott raised before. It means making it possible for people to earn enough to support a family. But my understanding of the evidence is that in and of itself is not going to put marriage back together, and not going to bring families, make families more stable, which is really what I think has to be the ultimate goal. And I haven't had a chance so much to make my case on this, but the family fragmentation that we've seen over the last 40, 50 years, I think has done more to contribute to decline of social capital than any other single factor. The family is the keystone of social relations. It isn't just the place where you have your first connections, your first social connections. It's where you learn to be a citizen, to be a social being. We, with family fragmentation, and I'm talking about divorce and single parenthood, both of which have gone in the wrong direction. Well, divorce has been stabilized, but we just have much more fragile relations in family life. And I think that families can't do their job when that happens. But I want to, there are a lot of people who get a little nervous when you start talking about this stuff, because it seems like such a personal decision. And it is a personal decision how you create a family, but you should know that we now can see that these personal decisions have huge ramifications within the broader society and for social capital for everybody. So to me, the most stunning evidence of this is from Raj Chetty, whose research some listeners may have heard of, where he looked at where the communities were that were seeing more upward mobility, more thriving among children. And what he found was that the chief difference between the communities where kids were doing better and kids were not was the percentage or the percentage of married couple families. Now, here's what I find fascinating. The kids who were growing up in single parent families in those communities were doing better than if, even, despite the fact that they're growing up with a single parent. So it created something within the community as a whole, the presence of married couple families. And that tells you that this social idea of social capital is for real, that is something that affects neighborhoods, entire communities. And you can't just come in and say, get married, But I think at least we need to make it clear that we know this. By the way, I would add that I suspect that schools also, where there are children from intact homes, are also more effective than those where there are dominated by children from single parent homes.
Mm. And Bob, I'm sure you have a lot of ideas. I do want to get to an audience question, though, from Janice, who was asking for you, Bob, about policing and policing reform. Is there a role for police reform that leverages social capital, maybe even supports social capital in inner cities? If you can respond, that'd be great, and feel free to offer any other policy ideas.
Yeah, here again, this is an example of the issue of police being exploited. The majority of Blacks who are suffering the problems in these inner cities recognize that as police undergo the Ferguson effect or police nullification and they withdraw from being aggressive in enforcing laws, it results in an increase in violent deaths in these communities. We've had 40 children under the age of 16 since George Floyd died were murdered in these cities, some as young as 1 year old. But you don't hear about that. And so the majority, according to the Pew studies, surveys, almost 80% of Blacks in those communities want more policing. 62% do not believe that institutional racism is their barriers that is holding them back. So what we're doing at the Woodson Center is we're bringing together hundreds of Black mothers who have suffered the deaths of children, and they are coming together at my organization to say they want police reform, but they want to join in partnership with the police to better protect them. And they wanted to help to define what reform looks like, how police deployment should take place. So this is an example of we need to give the voice to those who are suffering the problems, not the elites, both Black and white, who are talking about defund the police, but while they're living in gated communities and they don't have to suffer the consequence of their advocacy.
Mm. There's so many policy ideas here, and they all seem helpful. Scott, on the data side, how, for something like social capital that seems on the surface hard to measure, it does seem hard to measure, how can policymakers set policy goals and actually track progress on social capital formation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And props to the questioner who said I was a zealot on measurement, which I'll wear with a badge of honor. No, it is hard. Social capital is not something you can touch, but it does appear to be a real coherent thing. As our work showed, where all these indicators sort of correlate across geographies and across time. So I think the best way to do it is to use some kind of index. And I think you can worry too much about this or that index. It turns out that the one we created correlated very strongly across states with one that Bob Putnam had created in 1994, which we made the mistake of not looking at that ahead of time. But it was fortunate that they lined up so well.
This is Robert Putnam, the author of Bowling Alone, who also just came out with a new book this year.
Yes,
right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So his book Bowling Alone was the landmark text on social capital. So these things do tend to sort of move together, and I think in terms of measuring, sort of pick a measure, pick an indicator, and you can look at how it's changed over time, places where it's stronger or weaker. There's a lot of opportunity for local measurement if you wanted to sort of get down to the neighborhood level, and look at some of the things that Bob is talking about. You could field surveys to do that, and then once you kind of know where the way that things vary, you can target attention or resources on places where that you want to help. And as Bob says, it's super important to not go in thinking like you've got all the answers and that there's only deficits in these communities. Working with the communities directly, I think, is really important. But the measurement problem to me doesn't seem like a huge barrier in terms of trying to boost social capital. I think it's more just we need more creative thinking about how you return something that has disappeared over time in a lot of places or withered.
And partly just the progress that you've made here is making it very clear that social capital is a coherent thing. And even if you can't directly measure it, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist or isn't valuable. And the subcomponents of your index also just point to the fact that policymakers can look for warning signs that something is off. If charitable giving is off, family formation is off, crime is up, particular kinds of crime are up. Those seem like warning signs about something more fundamentally flawed or fundamental problems in social capital, even if you can't quite define it or see it clearly.
That's right. And I mean, I think there's a little bit of a double standard in economics, for instance, where they talk about human capital all the time. How do you measure human capital? Well, you find a standardized test and you relate test scores to outcomes, or you look, even worse, you look at sort of educational attainment and you use that as your indicator of everything we need to know about a person's human capital. Like those are simplifications too, but they're incredibly important. They've advanced policy quite a bit. So I think we can't have a double standard and think that it's impossible to research social capital.
And Kay, there's a question from the audience too about how can institutions like libraries play a role in this discussion? We haven't really addressed that, but there seem to be other kind of institutions out there that perhaps are partners in this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in New York, you see an awful lot of libraries that have taken that responsibility very seriously. They have children reading hours with kids, and they have various speakers come in. They welcome families in for various activities. And I think that those are terribly important. Museums also. And sometimes local businesses, well, I shouldn't say sometimes, a lot of times local businesses also see that as part of their responsibility. Again, bookstores in my neighborhood are often having events, or used to before COVID. And not to mention religious institutions as well. They play a big role in creating events and opportunities for people to get together and discuss things or just to enjoy each other.
Yeah, it's not just libraries, it's also businesses. I know we got a question from Hera in the audience on that. So Bob, as we look forward, you talked about areas for research. Are there other is there another number one priority for you, either on research or policy, that would be helpful to this discussion going forward?
Yeah, I really wish that more social scientists would leave their hallowed halls and come into communities and talk directly to people they write about. That would be enormously helpful, to sit and listen. When I was attracted to American Enterprise Institute as a civil rights activist, and I came to AEI because of Peter Berger and Richard John Newhouse, and I had a chance to work with Bob Nesbitt and Michael Novak on the Mediating Structures project in the 70s. And for about a 5-year period, there was an enormous interest on the conservatives about mediating structures, and they took it seriously, but only for a limited period of time. And Michael Novak said that the political party that takes seriously and invests in mediating structures would have political power well into the future. And he was right about that. But I've seen, but then conservatives do not have a ground game, and that's why traditional values that we all believe in, we're now counterculture, because the left has spent their time going into these communities, offering solutions that are harmful to the people, while many conservatives have remained aloof from those issues. And I think now that what they should do is, I think, engage directly. That's what we're trying to demonstrate with 1776 United. We're hoping that scholars will talk more directly to the people, grassroots leaders, whose lives exemplifies the principles that they write about. Nothing is more powerful than a witness, and experience will always prevail against an argument. And so our scholars can validate grassroots leaders who are activists, and they can validate the scholars, and the scholars can validate them, if we can just get them to do that. And that's what's needed. So we're hoping to provide a forum for that to happen.
That's powerful. Scott, as an embodiment of that conservative counterculture, where do we go from here?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Bob has said. I think if we're, so 2020, I think has sort of revealed the still very strong racial divisions in the country. I think if conservatives would devote a little bit more attention to issues of opportunity, including social capital, I think there are a lot of folks out there that would be willing to hear what we have to say. I think African American voters, Latino voters have become the moderate swing voters, potential swing voters of the Democratic coalition. And as conservatives, I think we just need to think more creatively about what a conservative opportunity agenda looks like, that's rooted in social capital, that takes seriously family decline, but that also takes seriously early childhood inequities, the importance of place. I think there's a lot we could do that would be more attractive than what's on offer from the other side.
Kate, final thoughts?
Yeah, I took the same takeaway from the election as Scott did. I think there is a big opportunity for conservatives to appeal to a more working class population of all colors, a multiracial coalition, as people keep talking about. I think that opportunity is still there, and I never would have imagined that I would be sitting here saying, the next generation of conservatives are going to come from immigrants, but I kind of think that's the way it's going.
Kay, Scott, Bob, thank you so much for being a part of this important discussion. I know this is helpful to all of us, and thank you for being a part of it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Michael.